Boirun. Bienvenidos a todos. Good evening. It's so great to have you all again here for our third and final part of this wonderful series on the foundation of Rabbinic Mysticism with our dear friend, Rabbi Aaron Haleva. This program, just to let you know, is sponsored and led by the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America through a brand new Sephardic Digital Academy initiative. It's a national partnership initiative with many other communities around the country, from New York to Miami to Seattle to Atlanta, and around the world even, including Athens and Turkey. And we're really excited to have educators teaching things from halakha to Sephardic perspective of Torah, to philosophy, to Ladino language and culture, Sephardic cooking, and so much more. And this is a nonprofit initiative, which means we really do depend on your support. So if you're ever interested in sponsoring future classes, similar to ones like Rabbi Haleva has done this three-part wonderful series, please reach out. We'd love to have you as a sponsor or as a partner. And we encourage you to find out more all about our additional classes at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. Now it's really my pleasure to introduce our dear friend, Rabbi Aaron Haleva. Rabbi Bechavod.
Good evening, everybody. I know it's a little bit late, but Chodesh Tov U'Mborach, and hopefully we will have a better month of Ab starting next year. So this is the third and final class in our series on foundations of Rabbinic Mysticism. And let me just review, I'll do a little recap, then I want to introduce a little bit new material. Then I have my chat window open for any questions, so I'll make sure to get them as they come in. And so I will pause a little bit after the recap to see if there is any questions. I just want to remind everybody, so you probably have heard, when most people hear the word mysticism, they think Kabbalah. And the truth is, the Kabbalah that we know with the core text of the Bahir, or the Zohar, or the Sefer Yetzirah, or things like that, although Sefer Yetzirah is old and it's a Gaonic text, all the others were either created, depending on your point of view, or revealed in Christian Spain after something called the Maimonidean controversy. And the way I see it, most of Spanish Kabbalah seeks to tell you some content about mystical or metaphysical subjects. The Maimonidean notion of mysticism, which is the rabbinic mysticism that he extracts from the Talmud or the Tosefta and the Mishnayot, and sayings of the Hachamim and Midrashim scattered throughout the Talmud, is not so much about seeing anything, but it's preparing your mind so that you can see. And although there's many metaphors referring to God and his abode and his palace, all of those really have to do with the person getting closer to the palace, which means being less and less a slave to his own imagination. So the primary text we've been studying here, which we finished in the Hebrew and the Arabic last week, and we're going to read in the English a little bit this week, is Maimonides Guide for the Perplexed, in Arabic known as the Lalit al-Ha'irin, part 1, section 2. So let me just do a little recap. An educated but mentally assimilated Jew asks Maimonides a question. Why were Adam and Eve punished by giving them the highest human development, which is the knowledge of good and bad, or good and evil? Maimonides' answer, the question has a false premise. Man had already reached his zenith prior to the sin. He was created with a Selem Elohim, loosely translated, image of God. And that's the subject of Guide 1, Part 1, which is built upon by what we're studying now. He had, part of that Selem Elohim was Sechel, Al-Aql in Arabic. It means like intelligence. With the intelligence, you distinguish between true and false. If you let go of a ball filled with air on the surface of the earth, does it go up or does it go down? It goes down. That's true. It doesn't go up. That's false. If you take the same ball filled with air and go to the bottom of a swimming pool and let go, does it go up or does it go down? It goes up because it floats, because its density of the air inside is less than the density of the surrounding water, and it doesn't go down. That's true, and saying it goes down is false. And that was the mind of Adam and Eve. As soon as they were created, that's the way they operated. Imagination, on the other hand, as opposed to intelligence, is concerned with good and bad. It is subjective and thus must be imposed by an authority. That's why this chapter plays on the three meanings of the word Elohim, and the one where the snake tells Eve, if you eat from this, you will be like Elohim, princes who know the difference between good and bad, because it requires a prince to impose kind of what's hot and what's not. It's the zeitgeist of society, which is determined by influencers, as we all know. The model for most of social media is the influencers influence and the masses go along. So if something's in style, it's good. And if something's out of style, it's bad. Often what was good 2 years ago is now bad, and something else is now good. That's Maimonides' answer in a nutshell. And now we're going to probe a little bit. So what's wrong with having your primary cognitive function be imagination as opposed to intelligence? And also I want to show you something very interesting. Can everybody see this slide 4 here? It says Babli Shabbat 145b. Very good. So I always like to point out and to investigate where Harambam, where Maimonides got the material he's describing or articulating in the guide. Because some people will tell you that Maimonides' sources for the guide are Greek philosophy. Now that's a little strange, because in the introduction to the guide, Maimonides wrote, and this is not a book about philosophy because there are already many of those and the world doesn't need another one. This book is about decoding cryptic statements of the Hachamim found in the Talmud and in the Midrashim. Now before I get to this, let me answer some of the questions. So from Avram Avishai. So Borei Olam, as the highest authority, states that during creation that the creations are good. When God says Tob, Vayar Elohim ki Tob, that's not the same as Tob Vara in human parlance. So God says that the creations are Tob. That simply means the following. They are in accord with his design. It means it came out, he was satisfied with the product, whatever that means. I'll just drop a brief hint of another midrash that says God is Boneh Olamot Umahariban. So God creates or builds universes and destroys them. And this may have happened many, many times, even on planet Earth. Now, when he destroyed it, it doesn't mean it was Ra. It means it didn't work out as he wanted. Second question, true and false includes some moral law, or all moral law is included in good and bad, like not murder? That's a very good question. So from the Hebrew rabbinic point of view, there is no such thing as morality. Morality is a Greco-Roman word, which assumes a kind of natural law. Of course, there is a Tov Vara as to what natural law is. So yes, not murder, but you must be aware that 200 years ago in England, good old London, England, if a peasant went on your land and ate an apple, he would be prosecuted with a death penalty case. Now, it didn't happen every time, but it could be. So a peasant doing any kind of theft could get the death penalty. So what murder doesn't include that? So what does murder include? And of course, certain kind of slaves were property, so there's no such thing as murder to a slave, etc. So in Judaism, there is no morality. Our, so to speak, morality derives wholly from the law because we don't believe in a natural law. If there was a natural law, you wouldn't need Sinai to reveal everything that people consider to be natural law. Third question, what are Harambam's practical prescriptions for those who want to live more using their intelligence rather than imagination? That's an excellent question. That's what the guide is for. It's called apophasis. There's a mental process people go through to debunk, to show themselves the ineptitude or inaptness of imagination for charting how they perceive things and charting their life. There's many, many sections dealing with it. And I want you to know we're going to read a book called Homo Mysticus, which is authored by my late teacher, Hacham Yosef Faur Halevi, as we say in Spanish, in Ganeden Keste. Some people say de feliz memoria. Now, he passed away about 2 months ago, and he wrote a book which is the best commentary on Maimonides Guide ever, in my opinion, ever. And it's divided into sections. The first section is about apophasis, which is this mental process that you go through to disabuse your mind of imagination. Does Rabbi Saadia not believe in natural? He may believe in natural law, and in some things, Harambam believed that the rabbinic tradition was a little bit different than Saadia may present it. It could be that he's presenting it to placate the audience in a sense, or it could be he believes it himself. I don't know. So now, let's go to the source, or one of the sources in rabbinic literature that echoes what we just studied in Guide Part 1, Section 2. So you remember that the snake represents imagination, and the interaction of Eve with this Nahash turned out bad for humanity. Is there a cure? So someone just asked, how do you live more under intelligence than imagination? Well, short answer for the Hachamim is the Torah. And here's the statement. This is in Masechet Shabbat, Daf 145b. Mipnei ma goyim mezuhamin. Why are the Gentiles slimed? Zohama means slime. Some people say filth, but the truth is it's slime. It's a noun that has to do with snakes and slugs, that they leave a slime where they go. Why are the Gentiles slimed? Shelo amdu al har Sinai, because they never stood at Sinai. Sha'a shebana hash al hava, because at the time, at the moment that the snake approached Eve, hitil baha zohama, he spewed slime on her. Sometime, now this is probably referring to those kind of snakes in the ancient Near East. You still see them in India. They spit at you. Before they attack, they spit at you. Yisrael sha'amedu al har Sinai, but the Israelites who stood at Har Sinai, means they experienced the revelation, paska zohamatan. Although they had slime on them, it stopped. Means they didn't get any additional slime. Goyim shelo amdu al har Sinai, but the Gentiles who never stood on Har Sinai, lo faska zohamatan, their slime never stopped. And I'll quote what Maimonides quotes this also in Part 2, Section 30. I'll read it from the English translation. It's nice to hear it also in English in real time as opposed to just listening to me translate. The following is also a remarkable passage, most absurd in its literal sense, but as an allegory, it contains wonderful wisdom and fully agrees with real facts, as will be found by those who understand all the chapters of this treatise, which means everything from the beginning up through Part 2, Section 30. When the serpent came to Eve, he infected her with poison. The Israelites who stood at Mount Sinai removed that poison. Now, this is not the greatest translation because paska zohamatan means the slime stopped. It doesn't mean it was removed. It doesn't mean na'akra zohamatan, or it was erased. Nimhaka zohamatan. It says faska zohamatan. It stopped. That means the effect of the snake is still there, but it didn't get worse. They found a way to stop it. And that stopping allowed them to see reality in a different way. Idolaters who did not stand at Mount Sinai have not gotten rid of it. Note this likewise. And I'll give you one more interesting midrash, which feeds into Maimonides' sources. In the same chapter, 2, Section 30, another noteworthy midrashic remark of our sages is the following. The serpent had a rider. The rider was as big as a camel, and it was the rider that enticed Eve. This rider was Samael. Samael is the name generally applied by our sages to Satan. In describing how the serpent came to entice Eve, our sages say the following. Samael was riding on it, and God was laughing at both the camel and its rider. So there was a snake, which represents the imagination. We'll see in a moment. There was the Satan, who Harambam did describe and did invoke, as we saw in the Hebrew in our chapter. This Satan was riding on it, and God was laughing at both the camel and its rider, which means God wasn't involved in persuading Adam and Eve to interact with the snake, to listen to the snake. It was their own internal organic choice. God didn't get involved in the choice, but he didn't promote either side either. And he was laughing at both the camel and its rider. I don't know fully what the laughing refers to. I just bring to your attention that this is congruent with how we explain the chapter and how we explain that story. And also it's important to note, Harambam says how absurd this midrash describing the slime of the snake is, if you take it literally. So some people will tell you, well, Maimonides, based on Greek philosophy again, that horrible influence that he had, interpreted Pesukim outside their original meaning. But the point is, the Hachamim obviously are talking about some allegorical, some hidden point or some symbolic use of the story of the snake. Nobody believes an actual reptile spoke with Eve. Why would I say that? Because as we studied before, well, maybe we didn't study it before, but in the part of Bereshit before the one we studied in connection with Harambam, the Targum once again gives you the rabbinic understanding of things. So it's when God created Adam, it says Vayipach be'apav nishmat hayim, and he blew into his nose a soul that's lively. Like we would say in Ladino, biva. Tenia alma biva. He wasn't a dud. He wasn't passive. He wasn't a wallflower. He was biva, you know? So the Targum translates that as ruach malela, a spirit or a personality trait that could speak. So Adam was the first creation who had language, or had language in the way we know it. So the snake doesn't have language. So Adam is the only one who has it. So this snake, whatever it is, it can't be a reptile like we see slithering on the ground because they can't speak. So obviously it refers to something symbolic. Now I want to, if there's no other questions, I want to go into Haham Fa'ur's book where he retells the story we just studied, and you get a little bit of a understanding of the story with a little bit of a different lens, and you'll see, but most of it is absolutely familiar, and I think you'll enjoy it. So let me share, and here we go. Okay, so this is his book, Homo Mysticus. This part of it is called Imagination. Surprise, surprise. And the first part, the first story he treats in the imagination is none other than the one we just studied, which was the interaction of Eve with the snake. Now, as I just told you, Harambam has a protocol for letting go of the hold of imagination on a person and kind of allowing reason or rationality to rise to the front, to rise to his main cognitive processes. And that protocol is called apophasis. It's a Greek word. And so the knowledge gained from apophasis is called apophatic knowledge in Haham Fa'ur's lingo. So let me just read this with you now. Oops. Open full screen. Okay, there we go. Apophatic knowledge is structurally connected with the Maimonidean theory of imagination. Imagination is incapable of matching the real ontological world. That means the world as it is outside of our mind, as it is to itself. The proofs, burhan, designed to bring about apophatic knowledge serve to counteract the effects of imagination. Thus, the doctrine that prophecy cannot descend but upon a sage who is eminent in wisdom. And this is quoting from Harambam's own work in the Mishneh Torah, which is Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, where he describes prophecy. And there he tells you that a prophet cannot be in a deluded or delusional state, driven by his own imagination and by the images that come up from his own unconscious, because that kind of person can't tell if an image he sees in a vision is from his own imagination, his own deep unconscious, what Freud may call the id, or it's a communication from God. So you have to clean your mind from your own imagination, and you have to at least be aware of your deep unconscious so that when you see it erupt, you know what it is. Maimonides opposed the application of positive attributes to God because these attributes are the figments of human imagination. God wants this. Hashem wants you to do X. God loves us. When we say God loves you, we have no idea what love means outside the context of a human being. When we say love, we say, oh, that my dog loves me. That's not the same as the way your wife loves you or your father loves you or your sister loves you. So we use love in a loose way, but when you use these human-based emotional terms or emotional descriptors and you apply them to God, what you're really doing is painting a God who's more like a human than anything else. There is nothing outside human fantasy corresponding to such a God. People indulging in positive attributes have nothing in their faith except empty words. But one who applies an attribute to him knows nothing except an empty word. The thing that he had imagined that this name applies to, however, is a subject that does not exist, a fraudulent illusion. It is as if he had applied that name to a non-existing subject because there is nothing in reality resembling it. This is a fundamental difference between Judaism and all other religions or cults or creeds. The Christians dealt with the problem, and you may have heard the song, "What If God Was One of Us?" And even theologians, Christian theologians say, the reason God has this three-faceted being is because man needs an aspect of God that man can relate to. So in Christianity, Jesus is a man because that's the only way humans could approach God. The Jewish version is quite different, but it's much harder. It's hard to reject a God which you once imagined is very much like you, because then you feel that you're in a void. You feel there's nothing there. That's the problem, and the Hachamim deal with this, but that's for a whole different story. Now I'll skip that. Let me just read what Harambam says here at the bottom of 57. One who is always thinking about God and mentions him repeatedly without knowledge, following only his imagination or following a belief, tikal, that he received as a tradition, halal, from someone else, is not only outside the divine abode and far from it, but in my opinion, he is not truly mentioning God or thinking of him, because the term in his imagination that he is articulating verbally does not correspond to anything in existence. It is an illusion fabricated by his imagination, as we have explained when discussing the attributes of God. So in the Torah, God creates man in his image. And that was the way man was before the snake episode. In Avodah Zarah, unfortunately, it's the opposite. Man creates God in his image, and that's why it's forbidden. But it's hard. It's hard to not think of a super being who created all of this, who has nothing to do with any human or other being you've ever seen or met in your life. That's the difficulty. So now let's sum up this little chapter. Imagination is a veil shrouding human rationality. Apophatic knowledge cannot generate understanding of God. Its purpose is to puncture imagination and to let the light come in, thus allowing humans to be rational. If you remove the influence of these, let's say, phantasmagoric images that arise in all of us, then you can see clearly. It's like being in the Matrix. Imagination is like the Matrix. Everything you see is false. You're a battery, really. The machines have generated this entire illusion for their own use, but you think it's real. Some people take the red pill. When you take the red pill, you are expelled from the pod. you land on the bottom of this crappy old, second-rate spaceship, and you see reality for what it is, and it's pretty dark, and it's pretty unwelcoming, but you see reality as it is. That's the initial experience of almost everybody who undergoes apophasis. It's difficult to leave the comforting imaginations we have about God and reality, but it's the only way to see. And that's what apophasis is for. Now, transference of meaning. And last week, Eddie Mishan asked an excellent question, and let me go back to it just so everybody can remember. Here we go. So I explained to you how this interaction with the snake was a choice. It was an internal choice, and the snake is actually using an external character, like in a morality play, to portray an internal dialogue within early man's own psyche. So the snake is kind of the other side of the choice. God said, don't eat from this, and the snake said, why don't you eat from this? So what happened? So after the snake makes his pitch, and here's the pitch, Ki yodea Elohim, because God knows, Ki biyom acholchem mimenu, the day you eat from that tree, v'nifkehu einechem, your eyes will be open, v'hitem kelohim, you'll be like princes, yoda'ayet tov v'ara, those who know tov v'ara. Now, when did the choice happen? Between Pasuk He and Pasuk Vav. How do I know? Because look at what Pasuk Vav says. Vatere ha'isha, so the woman saw, and this is not woman as in female versus male. This is an aspect of combined humanity. Why this is narrated with the woman side of man, that's described in the guide in several chapters, about 6, and that's a story for a totally different day. Or as they say in The Wizard of Oz, that's a horse of a different color. Now, the woman saw, Kitob ha'es lema'achal, how did she know it's good to eat? And then she said, because it is desirable for the eyes. Since when is food that looks good to eat? Well, on the Food Network it is, and on a billboard with a double Whopper from Burger King it is, but if you really are there when they're taking a picture, you know a totally different story. You know that there's a food scientist who sprays shellac on the burger patties, so when the camera operator takes a picture, it shines. But if anybody would ever try to eat that actual Burger King Whopper that's featured in the huge billboard, they get sick because it's made out of some kind of weird hydrocarbon. It's a kind of WD-40. You don't want to eat WD-40 on your burgers. So how does she know that because it looks good, not because it just looks good, but ta'avahu la'inayim, it's like when you see it, you crave it. And then moreover, v'nehmad ha'es lehaskil. How do you know that this tree would make you intelligent? You don't know that. So she had already entered the world of Tov Vara. That's why the pasuk very shrewdly starts. So she had already bought into the premise, and that was the beginning of the downfall. Now I'm going to go back to Hacham Fa'ur, and he's going to go into this now. So, in the Maimonidean economy of ideas, imagination is not a concept to be analyzed by a rational methodology, but is itself an independent mental discourse standing at the basis of the political, social, religious, and artistic activities of pagan humanity. It is the method by which Gentile civilization unfolds. Of course, all of those civilizations were pagan. So instead of seeing the waves as connected to the moon and the tides being caused because the moon exerts a gravity on the water, and the relative position of the moon and the oceans and the earth changes in a 24-hour period, they attributed the tides to some god. There's a god of the sea, and then there's a god of the underworld, and then there's a god of grain. And all these natural phenomena, which if you had just reason, you would try to understand how they come about and how they're interconnected. In the pagan mind, they really reflect a metaphysical being. And so that's what he means by the method by which Gentile civilization unfolds. It's a mythological civilization. It constitutes a pathological retrogression from Adam's ability to reason. Before sinning, Adam was endowed with the ability to reason, a radically different mental process than imagination. At that stage, human language consisted of names. You may remember in the chapter right before the one I just showed you, it says God brought all the animals to Adam, and whatever Adam called them, that became their name. For human society, obviously, that's what it means. It was capable of predication because it could take a subject that it just invented, horse, and say, horse, that's brown. That's a predicate, right? The subject is horse, the predicate is brown. And it excluded the syntactical apparatus enabling transference of meaning. That's very important. Early man's language did not allow for transference of meaning, which we're going to explain in a moment. Adam's sin consisted in suppressing this mental process in favor of imagination. Maimonides called attention to the Hebrew term for snake, nahash, a term that, as the commentators noted, means also divination. In fact, some of the earliest religions in existence had to do with divination, means like predicting the future, predicting what the gods want, how to propitiate them by looking at snakes. That's why the Hindus have this ancient tradition of snake charming, and some of the Protestants in the United States picked it up. You may have heard of them. As part of their worship, they handle snakes. They're called snake handlers. And it even showed up in Harry Potter, if some of you remember. There's a name for it, which I forget, Napassel something, Passel mouth, is a talent that people have for speaking with snakes. Who told the mythologist behind the story, or from which the author of Harry Potter drew, that a snake has some special secret language, and if you speak the language of the snake, it's an ancient archetype deep in every human's unconscious. So the Torah confronts it right up front, and he tells you the problem where Adam and Eve slipped into imagination had to do with divination. And this leads directly into the Vickian concept of divination divine. So this is referring to Giambattista Vico, who Haham Faur believes, and I agree with him, was a converso, 100% converso family. And the people he shared his book with, which is called The New Science of Giambattista Vico, in which he supports Israelite history and sees it as unique in the world, was shared only with other Jews in Livorno. So he shows you from a deep analysis of Latin the connection between divination and divine. And Rabbi Ishaq Abarbanel, that's the famous courtier for Ferdinand and Isabella, incorporated this radical idea in his commentary on Bereshit 3:22 as follows. Imagination is connected with divination and transference of meaning. And the snake was more cunning than all the animals of the field. It means that Adam's imaginative faculty was more crafty than the imaginative faculty of all the other animals of the field. Because human imagination is capable of making syllogisms and arguments appearing to be true, transference of meaning, something that the imagination of other animals cannot do. The snake was regarded by them, the rabbis, as symbolic of the imaginative faculty because it, the imagination, which is peculiar to diviners, menahashim, leads to corruption. Now let me pause. Parcel tongue, thank you very much, that's right. Let me see now. Let's go back to a question from Raymond Habaz. How does this connect to God's punishments of Adam, Eve, and the snake? I wish I had time to tell you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, but what all those terms mean in God's closing speech about the enmity between Eve and the snake, and why the snake will go slithering on his belly, and why Eve's most vulnerable on her heel, but it's the heel that she uses to hurt the snake. Harambam develops that in part 2 in 4, 5, or 6 different chapters. It's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful subject, but it would literally take its own 3 hours. Aaron Levy reminds me of this line from Ben Amoseg's page. God is merely a product of the human mind. Ben Amoseg explained that Feuerbach is essentially right. However, what people call God is a limited human perception of the apophatic infinite absolute. Yes, that's right. Excellent. Thank you. Is the experience of the Pardes a process of apophatic thinking? Are there dangers to it? So that's a good question. No, it's not. You are not allowed to enter the Pardes unless you're prepared for it. How do we know if you're prepared? Because the Pardes has two aspects. You have to tell your teacher, you don't do the Pardes by yourself. You have a teacher, and you propose to the teacher a initial derasha. And if you pass, means if he says, I accept your derasha, I'm allowing you to enter into the Pardes, then you have a certain experience. The experience only comes after the teacher allowing you to enter by approving your harsa'ah, it's called. All of this is described in the second chapter of Hagigah, which is itself 5 hours explanation. But so there are dangers to it because it's always a matter of choice. Most of the people who entered the Pardes succeeded. The second chapter of Hagigah, which is about the 4 who entered the Pardes, 3 out of 4 failed. There's a reason for that, but that's part of the story, and I don't want to get sidetracked. Can this only be achieved by a prophet, or can anyone reach this level? From the point of view of Harambam and the rabbis, anyone can develop their mystical side. Now, anyone can reach what we call Ruach HaKodesh, the spirit of the sanctuary. It's a kind of proto-prophecy. Of those who could reach Ruach HaKodesh, a small subset can reach prophecy. However, Harambam believed you could increase the yield of how many people who reach Ruach HaKodesh could actually reach prophecy, Nibu'ah. And he wanted to open a school to train prophets. And he felt that by so doing, he would dramatically increase the yield. His son was interested in that as well. And I think he did it to some extent, but he borrowed some of the methods of the Sufis, which actually were originally borrowed from the Hebrews in the first place. So that's how he did that. Okay, that's the last question. Very good, thank you. And I'll stop when I see a little bit of a queue of questions. Let's go back to here now, back to Harambam. Divination is not only the most primitive form of religion, but more importantly, represents transference of meaning, whereby a given phenomenon or object is associated with a specific augury. That means predict the future. Tell the state of something by looking at the entrails of a dead bird, and is perceived not as it is per se, but as something else. So you don't see a sliced open bird with his intestines and internal organs, gizzard, etc., as a dead bird. You see it as, oh, this means A, B, C. So this is, you're seeing it as something else, and the as something else you project from your own imagination. This is common in schizophrenics. It is also present in the thought development of a child, as when a child plays with a stick and calls it a horse, or takes a little plastic sword and thinking he has a laser sword from Star Wars, which is common and fine if you're a child, but it's not common if you perpetuate that into adulthood. Borrowing from Eliade, in this realm, things undergo an imaginative transfiguration and are perceived in terms transcending sensory perception. So it's like when people say, this is a holy spot, and they perceive some kind of spirit hovering over it, but you can't see a spirit with your rational mind. You can't. So if you project a spirit on this temple, this river, this holy mountain, this volcano, you're indulging in imaginative transfiguration. I'll get to the queue of questions in a moment. I just want to finish this. Perceived in terms transcending sensory perception. In modern philosophy, seeing as was discussed by Wittgenstein. By the way, his mother was not Jewish, but his father was. Invariably, the as is not part of the object itself, but is projected onto the object by the viewer. Mythological discourse involves a fundamental process of transformation and displacement. Through reflexive associations, the object per se is displaced and perceived as something other than itself. At the religious level, seeing as constitutes avodah zarah. You're perceiving an object as having some kind of metaphysical powers, which it doesn't have. It's just a rock. Through a process of displacement and projection, a sensory object like a totem, a star, an image, is imaginatively transfigured into a supernatural being. Linguistically, it allows for a syntactical procedure whereby transference of meaning is possible. Now here's one of the punchlines. Transference of meaning is at the core of the first sin. And we just studied this. Eve associated the fact that the tree is a pleasure to the eyes with good for eating, thereby concluding that it was delightful for understanding. She's just projecting this. There's no rational index or indicia in that tree that would tell her that. It is no coincidence that thereon God's presence is grasped through transference of meaning. Before the sin, Adam and Eve heard sound per se. Means you heard the wind rustling in the trees, you said, there's the wind. Thereafter, borrowing from Wittgenstein, the sound was heard as, like the first Viking giants who associated the sound of the thunder with the voice of Jove. After the sin, Adam and Eve associated the sound of the daily wind, Leruah Hayom, a common natural phenomenon, with the voice of God and hid themselves in fear. Now, Adam and Eve spoke to God directly because that's how they got this mitzvah in the first place. Why would God change his voice from articulate speech? You're the first being on the planet who has language. God can speak to you because you understand. In order to understand language, you must have language and be able to use language. God speaks to you. And now, all of a sudden, God doesn't have an articulate voice, but he's wind. And Eve took it seriously. Proto-man, after the first sin, after they ate from the Eis Hadat, they no longer perceived normal natural phenomena as what they were. They perceived them as something supernatural. Let's see, I'll move here. A similar transformation took place at the visual level. Immediately after sinning, their eyes were opened and they knew, that they were naked. Scripture, Maimonides observed, does not say that their eyes were open and they saw that they were naked. It wasn't a sensory viewing. The senses was the same exact image. The change did not take place at the optical or physiological level. Neither was it a case of perceptual alteration as with acute types of schizophrenia. It only affected their mode of perception. In other words, the brain, the optic nerves, and the eye projected the same old image on their mind that it had before, but it's how they interpreted it. It's the software. Whereas before the sin they saw, thereafter they saw as. It involved a radical change of orientation. Citing to the pasuk, Teshaneh fanav vaygareshehu, which we read last week in Eyob, a verse alluding to Adam's expulsion from Eden, Maimonides noted that in Hebrew, face stands for direction or purpose. Adam's banishment from paradise was a direct result of a change in orientation, mental, social, cultural, turning away from the world of reason. Adam transfigured the Garden of Eden into a barren land. This conforms with Maimonides' thesis, whereby Deus absconditus is the effect of homo absconditus. So let me just explain that, and then I'll get to the question. So now, this is really, for me, was a blow your mind away point. Let me read it again. Adam's banishment from paradise was a direct result of a change in orientation. Turning away from the world of reason, Adam transfigured the Garden of Eden into a barren land. So was he actually ever expelled from a physical place? No, no siree bub, as we used to say in the Great Northwest, not at all. And it's not that he did something wrong, he sinned, so God punished him by giving him pain or stress, by saying, you're out of the Garden of Eden. It was the same Garden of Eden as it always was. Just like the wind going through the garden was the same as it always was. Just like Adam and Eve being naked was the same as it always was. But after this sin, they couldn't see the Garden of Eden for what it was. And they transfigured it in their minds into a barren land. That's part of the punishment. And we don't have time for it. But if you read carefully the Pisukim where God makes this speech to Adam and Eve after the sin, he's telling them, you can no longer eat from the bounty of the garden, you're going to have to deal with sticker bushes and thorn bushes and weeds, and that's what's going to grow for you. That's actually, in my opinion, a reference to his mind. What's going to grow in your mind is no longer fresh, succulent saplings, which in the Hebrew mind represent development of knowledge. And I got this idea from Solomon himself in the book Kohelet, but we don't have time to explain why. You're going to only see weeds, but you're transfiguring all of this. Nothing in your actual reality changed. Your mind changed it all for you. It's like someone who entered the matrix. And all of this, you don't see it as it really is. I'll just read this paragraph and then I'll go to the questions. Because he, Adam, had changed his direction, striving toward things that he was previously ordered not to aim at, he was expelled from the Garden of Eden, but not externally by God. He expelled himself. The punishment fits the sin. Measure for measure, that's the famous rabbinic statement, midah keneged midah, because he had been authorized to eat from the best and to delight in leisure and calm. But instead, as mentioned before, he frolicked in the pursuit of his delight and his imagination and ate what had been forbidden to him. He resembled the animals in his eating and in most of his habits. Surprise, surprise, guess who else this happened to? He was a man and he became an animal, and it's as the Pesukim go so far as to say that he would walk on all fours and sleep with other animals, and he ate grass. Anybody have any idea who I'm talking about? Nebuchadnezzar, the famous Nebuchadnezzar, as narrated in the book of Daniel, a fantastic book, and it has the most beautiful ta'amim, if you've heard it recited. I saw the last vestiges in Seattle in the 60s of people who would ladinar Daniel and Kohelet. They would read the Pesukim in Spanish, but with the ta'amim of the Hebrew. It's an amazing thing. It's very sad that we lost that, by and large. So anyhow, that's this exact same thing that Adam did happened again to Nebuchadnezzar. So anyhow, let me go to some of these questions. Okay. Rahmiel Travitz, a fine Talmid Chacham. If you can be a monotheist and still fall into the trap of imagination as Eve did, and as Christians do, then it isn't the monotheism of the Torah that allows one to overcome imagination. What then is it of the Torah that allows one to overcome pagan imagination if it isn't monotheism? That's an excellent question. So we're used to characterizing Judaism as monotheist, but the truth is, all these theological terms, they don't mean anything. From the point of view of the Torah, you first do the mitzvot, you first do an action, and you become a monotheist as a result of this process. Your monotheism is a product of the process of the mitzvot. It's like, if any of you ever saw the movie The Karate Kid. You can't know balance by talking about balance. You only know balance by first doing wax on, wax off, paint the fence, sand the deck, all this kind of stuff. And then you stand on that rowboat, if anybody saw the movie, and you try to balance by standing one foot on each side of a rowboat, where Mr. Miyagi, the sensei, is intentionally making it rock back and forth. The mitzvot are actions. They're like what some therapists call homework. You have to do the homework. Whatever comes out of that, that's going to be a monotheism because you're going to be disabused of the seduction of paganism. But it's not about monotheism. It's about the practices we have to inculcate Hebraic monotheism. So when we compare Judaism to other religions, we always tend to compare the theory. We don't compare the process. And of course, Christianity erased the process. They thought it was too hard. So they don't have works. They only have faith. That doesn't work. You cannot become Jewish by talking about abstract concepts. It will just not work. Now, from Yosef Malka to everyone, how can we reconcile this disapproval of imagination and seeing as with a constant use of metaphor in rabbinic thought? Excellent question. Here we are. Now, we're not going to read this section, but after the section, I'm going to finish in a moment. Hacham Faur adroitly takes you to. So if imagination, Maimonides' theory of imagination is in many ways negative, what's the point of having imagination? Because Adam and Eve were created with imagination also. It's just that they goofed on what's your primary function. What is it? Maimonides held a positivistic view of imagination. I can't go into why, but you cannot ever be a prophet. You cannot ever be creative if you don't have imagination. Imagination allows man to guess with limited data what to do next. You could never have a rocket ship before there was ever one invented if you didn't imagine, well, what if we had the ability to fly? So the Wright brothers imagined flight and they succeeded. And someone looking at the Wright brothers said, well, what if we can we fly straight up? And that's a rocket ship. Could we apply some of the principles of the Wright brothers and make a rocket ship? Yeah, we could. But all of it won't work. There's some missing pieces. What could those be? And it comes via your imagination. But a positive imagination requires first disabusing yourself of the imagination introduced by the snake. First, you must get rid of that so that, as Faur said and Hanamam said, here it is. Imagination is a veil shrouding human rationality. Apophatic knowledge cannot generate understanding of God. Its purpose is to puncture imagination and to let the light come in, thus allowing humans to be rational. Once you are rational, then you can use your imagination to reach a little bit of, stretch yourself and see what you couldn't have seen before. For example, prophetic visions like Yeshaya or Yehezkel, they all saw visions. Everybody except Moses, as a matter of fact, saw visions. A vision is seen through your imagination and later you reflect upon it with your rational mind. But you could never see it if you didn't have imagination. Don't we all go through similar mental transformation when suddenly most adored relationship or things suddenly look silly? Yes, we do. And in Jungian psychology, there's something called projection of the anima or the animus, whereas every man has a female side, every woman has a male side. When a man and woman get married initially, or if they're young, they tend to project their female side, which means everything they want in a woman on their wife, not really seeing her for who she is. And then after some time, it may be a rude awakening, it may be a pleasant and gradual awakening, but it's sooner or later, the man has to be realize that she's not what he projected on her. She is not his ideal female from his imagination pre-married days. She is who she is. And hopefully that leads to the couple actually seeing who they are. But yes, but the problem is most people who undergo a breaking of a fantasy don't seem to be able to do the same process generally for all their fantasies. Many people are not aware of all the fantasies they have. From Eliot Levy, what was wrong with Cain's killing of Hevel or with the reactions of Dor HaMabul? Morality is just conventional and they weren't commanded anything yet. Well, we believe that they were commanded this, oh, no, you're right, before Noah. Nothing per se. They were irrational. And like a wolf pack, they eat each other. And so God said, well, here's the problem. The Selim Elohim is alive in a small strain from Adam through Noah. And this is what Yehuda Halevi goes through in the Kuzari. If I allow the Dor HaMabul to stay the way they are, they will persecute and ultimately snuff out, like a totalitarian state snuffs out individuality. This line, who I have my hopes for, so I have to do something. That's what it's about. And they're the victim of their own stupidity. So God is not going to, have a trial to try and see, well, do they have zechut and so on and so on and so forth. You read some time ago that one archaeologist believes the story of Adam and Eve is a metaphorical story of transition of hunter-gatherer societies into farming ones. Yeah, I think the Hebrew point of view is not that. I would disagree with that. I think That history of transition from hunter-gatherers to farmers happened long before Adam and Eve were ever created. I don't think Adam and Eve are the first humanoids on the planet, not at all. That's why in Sephardic lingo, and I'm sure many of you have heard this. So we always, when we want to say be straight, be a nice guy, we say be a ben adam, or we say oh es un bueno, es un ben adam, halis ben adam esto. He's a real ben adam. Why is it that son of Adam is such a good thing? Because we were well aware that there's humanoids walking around who are not, literally are not sons of Adam. There Neanderthals, you could call them, Cro-Magnons, any one of those names you want to call them. I don't believe that Adam and Eve are the first humanoids. I believe they're the first humanoids with a Selem Elohim. And that's why when God appears to Yehezkel, the first prophet in a foreign land in Babel, no other prophet had ever been existing, no Hebrew prophet outside of the land of Israel. He addresses Yehezkel how? Ben Adam. There is a strain of humanity which you Israelites embody. I know you're surrounded by non-Israelites, but I'm addressing you as Ben Adam. You need to tune in to that ancient trace of Adam to survive. Okay, let me read the last paragraph and we'll finish with that, which I wanted you to see. And here it is. And this is the sum of Haham Fa'ur's chapter we've been reading. Of course, there's more. Following the Aramaic translation of the Pentateuch, Maimonides interpreted the verse, "You shall be like divinities, knowing good and evil, v'hitim kelohim yoda'ai tov v'ra." And by the way, the Christian world translates Elohim as gods. That's why the original sin has so much mystery to it. To mean not gods, but political leaders. Maimonides observed that Elohim has three meanings. Generally, it is used for God or divinity. It is also used for angel, because in Hebrew, as in Greek, an angel is a messenger. A divine messenger representing God could be designated by the name of the sender. That's why you would call an angel, a malach, as Elohim. The third connotation, political leader, reflects the deification of kings common in the ancient world and archaic societies. And I'll tell you one nugget I learned from whom? Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was a Talmid Chacham. He loved Hebrew. He taught himself Hebrew. He read Harambam's Mishneh Torah. He translated large parts of it into Latin, believe it or not. And his colleagues thought he was nuts for studying Torah. They thought he was nuts. And he refused to take holy orders, which is why he had to leave Cambridge and couldn't be a full professor, which is why he became the head of the mint in London. He discovered that every ancient worship of Avodah Zarah, every ancient god was once a live human being who died, and he was buried underneath the temple. Or in other words, when he died and when he was buried, they built a temple over his tomb and they worshiped him as a god. Even the Romans, you could still be Caesar, you could still be alive and the emperor, and they still deified you. They deified Augustus and they deified, I think, Caesar himself. And they would give korbanot to the living emperor. So you could be Augustus Caesar, walk into a temple of Augustus and offer yourself a korban, believe it or not. So he discovered that. He wrote a wonderful book called The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Revised, and he describes all of that. By specifying that Elohim here refers to those having the power to regulate good and evil, that is the realm of the conventional, the snake was ascertaining that by Elohim, political authority was intended. In the same chapter, Maimonides cited a biblical passage describing humans as a little less than Elohim. That's Tehillim chapter 8. Within that context, that means angel or messenger of God. Man could be almost a malach. Adam had the choice of reason, in which case he would have been a messenger of God. He also had the choice of imagination, leading to political mastery. The subsequent development of humankind would depend on this choice. And with that, I'm a little bit over, but I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I understand the turnout for these classes has been significant, substantial, wonderful. I really had a great time, and stay tuned and check out, of course, the entire offerings by the Sephardic Brotherhood, La Hermandad Sefaradi de la America. And thank you very much for your kind attention, and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Chacham. Hazak u'Baruch. It seems like we have a lot more demand even for another class, so who knows? People seem very excited.
Very good. All right. Nochada buena a todos.
Nochada buena. Merci mucho.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.